Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. It began with one choice, a single, unremarkable moment that tipped the balance of existence and set reality on a path to ruin. Dr. Soren Hale stood alone in the dim glow of the Q-Lab, his reflection flickering faintly on the curved glass of the control interface. This was no ordinary decision. The machine before him, the Q-Gate, was unlike anything humanity had ever conceived, a device capable of threading through the fabric of time and tethering choice to reality itself. He knew what the activation meant. He knew the warnings, the failures of those before him. Yet, he was here, staring at the small, unassuming console as if it were the beating heart of the universe. There had been warnings. They came from whispered reports and classified briefings, cautious words scribbled on the edges of blueprints long since destroyed. Even those who built the machine couldn't fully explain the forces they had invited into existence. The Q-Gate wasn't supposed to be operational, not in his lifetime, not in anyone's lifetime. Yet it was here, humming softly, waiting for someone with the resolve, or the recklessness, to press the command. Soren's fingers hovered above the final sequence, the keys glowing faintly as if taunting him to proceed. He had spent years chasing this moment, convincing himself that every ethical boundary crossed, every regulation ignored, had been necessary. Necessary for progress, necessary for a second chance, necessary to bring Isolde back. Her name echoed in his mind, soft and distant, like a fading dream that refused to be forgotten. This was the moment he had imagined over and over, a chance to undo the unbearable finality of her absence. The room seemed unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums and amplifies every hesitation. He glanced at the timer. Once initiated, the Q-Gate would take exactly 90 seconds to achieve its full charge. 90 seconds before the quantum threads of infinite timelines would unravel, entangle, and reform. 90 seconds to make the most consequential choice in the history of human existence. As his mind wrestled with the weight of the decision, he began to notice something unusual, an ever so slight distortion in the air around him. It wasn't visible in the way light bends or refracts. It was felt. The walls seemed less solid, the edges of the console less defined. Time itself seemed to stretch and contract, as if aware of what was about to unfold. Soren exhaled sharply and began to key in the activation code. The sequence was long, deliberate, designed to prevent accidental engagement. Each press of his fingers felt heavier than the last, the subtle vibration of the machine increasing with every input. It was during the final keystrokes that he faltered. Something was wrong. His own reflection in the glass console. He could swear it had moved, just a fraction of a second out of sync with his actual motion. A trick of the light, perhaps, or maybe something else. He shook the thought away and completed the sequence. The Q-Gate's hum deepened, a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then came the countdown, a mechanized voice announcing the seconds left until full activation. The finality of it was almost unbearable. As the voice droned on, he glanced at the monitors. Nothing unusual. No anomalies. No signs of the catastrophic rupture so many had feared. Yet something in the pit of his stomach told him he had already crossed a line, one he might never retreat from. And then it began. The first sign was subtle. A faint ripple across the console display, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. He stared, heart pounding, as the ripple grew into waves, spreading outward and distorting the data streams in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One by one, the monitors began to flicker, not with static but with images. Not from his lab, not from any camera feed. These were fragments, snippets of places and moments he didn't recognize. Cities towering above the clouds, forests consumed by ash, faces of strangers staring directly at him through the glass. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, growing louder, angrier. The lab lights flickered, casting brief shadows that danced and stretched unnaturally. He turned toward the main console, where the countdown continued uninterrupted, oblivious to the chaos building around it. The distortion in the air grew more intense, warping the space until even the floor beneath him seemed to shift, ever so slightly out of alignment with his steps. As the final seconds ticked away, he looked back at the console and froze. Reflected in the glass wasn't just his face, it was another version of him. Older, worn, eyes hollow and haunted. The reflection met his gaze and mouthed something he couldn't hear. A warning, a plea, and then it was gone. The countdown reached 0, and the Q-gate roared to life. As the Q-gate roared to life, Soren Hale stood frozen, unable to pull his gaze from the console. The lab, once a fortress of precision and logic, felt unervingly fragile. He had spent years in this space, fine-tuning equations, perfecting the designs, and now, the hum of the machine resonated with the weight of everything he had fought for, and everything he stood to lose. Soren wasn't the kind of man easily swayed by fear or doubt. Those qualities had been stripped from him the day he lost Isolde. She was his anchor, the only person who saw the man beneath the layers of calculation and ambition. Her absence was not just a void, it was a gnawing certainty that he had failed. The accident had been so sudden, so inexplicable. One moment she was by his side and the next gone. Every explanation, every investigation, had yielded nothing but dead ends and theories that could never satisfy the ache of loss. It was that ache that brought him here, to this forbidden moment. He had read every warning about the Q-gate, every grim projection from those who had studied its potential. Global bans were issued when the first prototype revealed just how far-reaching its effects could be. The idea of threading timelines together was tantalizing, but the risks were too great. Fractures, overlaps, anomalies, phenomena that couldn't be reversed, only contained. Yet Soren had ignored them all. The world's fear of the unknown had become his obsession. And Isolde, her memory, her smile, the way she used to challenge his unshakable logic, had become his singular focus. But he wasn't alone in his convictions. Kael Vryn had been a part of the project since the beginning, though their paths had diverged sharply. Kael was cautious where Soren was bold, pragmatic where Soren was unyielding. The two of them had once been allies, even friends, but the years had eroded that bond. Kael had tried to stop him before, warning that the Q-gate wasn't a tool for salvation. It was a trap, a doorway that opened to infinite chaos, where no outcome could be controlled. Soren dismissed Kael's warnings as the cowardice of a man unwilling to risk everything for something greater. The last conversation they'd had echoed in his mind now, as the lab seemed to tremble under the Q-gate's growing energy. Kael's voice had been steady, almost resigned. "You think you're chasing certainty, Soren. But the moment you activate that machine, you lose control. The timelines don't bend for us, they swallow us whole. Isolde wouldn't want this. You know that?" Soren had walked away then, unwilling to let doubt creep into the cracks of his resolve. Kael's words lingered, though, not because they held truth, but because they reminded Soren of something he hated to admit. He wasn't sure what Isolde would have wanted. He couldn't know. That was the cruelty of her absence. It left only questions, never answers. The monitors around him flickered again, pulling him back to the present. This wasn't the first time he had seen anomalies while working on the Q-gate. He called them echo timelines. They were faint, fleeting glimpses of possibilities that brushed against his own reality. Sometimes it was just a flicker, a face he didn't recognize in a reflection or a shift in the layout of the lab, gone in an instant. Other times, they lingered long enough to make him question whether they were accidents or warnings. He had once seen his own hand marked with a scar he didn't possess, and it had haunted him for weeks. The existence of echo timelines was both a promise and a threat. They were proof that the Q-gate worked, that timelines could intersect and interact, even if only briefly. But they also hinted at the instability of such intersections. If brief moments could ripple through his reality, what would happen when the Q-gate reached full activation? That was the question no one could answer. and that was why the world had buried the project under layers of secrecy and fear. Soren didn't care about their fears. He only cared about the one timeline that mattered, the one where Isolde was still alive. He had spent years tracing her accident back through theoretical threads, mapping the points of divergence where her fate could have changed. There was one critical moment, one choice that had set everything else into motion. If he could reach that moment, if he could tether the timeline to his own and force the change, he could save her. He was certain of it. Or at least, he had convinced himself to be. The hum of the Q gate grew louder, a steady, unrelenting vibration that seemed to pulse with the energy of 1,000 unseen possibilities. The lab felt smaller now, as if the space itself was folding inward, compressed by the weight of what was happening. Soren glanced at the main console, watching the streams of data cascade across the screen. The numbers should have reassured him. They were precise, predictable, but they didn't. Something about them felt off, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He reached for the failsafe control, his fingers hesitating just above the surface. The failsafe was a last resort, designed to shut the machine down if the energy levels exceeded critical threshold. It had been his concession to Kael, a way to placate his former friend without actually intending to use it. Now, the thought of pressing it felt like admitting defeat. And Soren Hale wasn't a man who admitted defeat. The Q-gate surged, and for the briefest moment, the flickering monitors stabilized. What they displayed wasn't data or code, it was an image. A face. Isolde. She looked directly at him, her expression calm, almost serene, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. His breath caught in his throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came. Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The flickering returned, more violent this time, and the lab's lights dimmed. Soren's hand clenched into a fist as he stared at the console. He knew what Kael would have said, what anyone else would have done. Shut it down. Walk away. But that wasn't an option, not for him. Not when he was this close. Not when he had already crossed the line. Soren Hale pressed the final command, and the Q-gate surged to life. The low hum deepened into a resonance that filled the lab, vibrating through the floor and walls, through his body, through the air itself. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, raw and unrelenting. The lights above flickered in uneven patterns, their intensity fluctuating as if they were gasping for stability. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if this was a mistake. That thought barely had time to form before it was swallowed by what came next. The console screen blazed with light, streams of data flashing faster than the human eye could process. Soren shielded his face as a burst of heat radiated from the machine. The room felt heavier, the air thick with an unexplainable pressure. Then, in a flash that lasted less than a heartbeat, everything changed. He staggered backward as his vision distorted, the lab warping around him like reflections in shattered glass. He blinked, tried to focus, but the harder he looked, the more the world unraveled. His legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him wasn't entirely there. He braced himself against the console, but even its surface seemed to ripple under his touch. And then he saw them, the fragments. They appeared without warning, sudden and intrusive, like pieces of memories that weren't his. Faces, places, moments. A cascade of possibilities flooding his senses all at once. In one fragment, he was standing in a sunlit meadow, Isolde smiling at him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. In another, he was shackled to a metal chair, his face bloodied, a figure looming over him with a shadowed expression. The fragments came faster, sharper, each one pulling him further from the present. There was a version of the world where towering cities stretched into the skies, their edges blurred, as if the structures defied the laws of physics. There was another where fire consumed everything, the horizon glowing red with destruction. He saw himself in countless forms, older, younger, broken, triumphant. In one timeline, he was surrounded by strangers chanting his name with reverence. In another, he stood completely alone, his hands trembling as he stared at the desolation around him. But it wasn't just the visuals. There were sounds, sensations, emotions, all layered on top of each other. A ringing in his ears grew louder, matching the pitch of the Q-gate's hum. He felt the cold grip of fear, the warmth of love, the sting of betrayal, all at once, as if the boundaries of his mind had been torn open. He tried to focus on the one fragment that mattered, the one where Isolde was alive. He searched for her face in the chaos, straining to hold onto the glimpse he'd seen before. But every time he thought he found her, the fragment shifted, dissolving into another possibility just out of reach. He reached out instinctively, as if he could pull her image from the storm, but his hand found only empty air. The lab's walls began to bend, their angles no longer behaving as they should. Monitors detached from their mounts, floating upward as if gravity itself had become uncertain. The distortion grew stronger, warping the space around him. He could feel it now, reality slipping away, the threads of time and space fraying at the edges. And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the Q-gate shut down. The lab was plunged into silence, broken only by Soren's ragged breathing. The flickering lights steadied, the monitors crashed to the floor, and the hum of the machine faded into nothingness. He stood there, his hand still gripping the console, as the world slowly settled back into place. But it wasn't the same. It couldn't be. The air felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. The objects in the lab seemed slightly out of sync, their edges too sharp or too blurred. He looked down at his hands, half expecting them to dissolve or shift into something unrecognizable. They didn't, but the unease remained. Then he noticed the first crack. It wasn't in the walls or the console, it was in the air itself, a thin, jagged line that shimmered faintly, hovering just above the floor. It didn't move, didn't spread, but it pulsed faintly, as if alive. Soren reached for it cautiously, but as his fingers approached, it disappeared, leaving only the faintest ripple in its wake. He stumbled back, his mind racing. The Q-gate was offline. It shouldn't have been able to leave any lasting effect. Yet here it was, the unmistakable sign that something had changed. The lab might have appeared intact, but the foundation of reality had shifted. He could feel it, as certain as he felt the weight of his own body. Soren turned to the monitors, hoping for answers, but they were blank, their screens cracked from the impact of their fall. He moved to the backup console, but before he could even begin a diagnostic, he saw something that stopped him cold. His reflection in the console glass. It was him, but not him. The face staring back was older, lined with scars that hadn't been there moments ago. The eyes were different too, hardened, weary, as if they had seen things no one should ever witness. The reflection tilted its head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. And then it smiled. The gesture was brief, a flicker of movement that sent a chill racing down his spine. He staggered away from the console, his breath shallow, his mind grasping for an explanation that didn't exist. The reflection remained for a moment longer, watching him, before it faded into the blank surface of the glass. Soren's heart pounded as he turned back to the Q-gate. He had activated it to save Isolde, to fix what had been broken. But now, as he stood in the aftermath, he realized he had done something far worse. The Q-gate hadn't just touched one timeline, it had fractured them all. And whatever he had glimpsed in those fragments, whatever had stared back at him from the glass, wasn't gone. It was here, somewhere, waiting. The crack in reality didn't vanish completely. Though it shimmered and disappeared, its absence felt as heavy as its presence had been. Soren Hale stood motionless in the lab, staring at the Q-gate, the console, the broken monitors, everything that once seemed to belong to the orderly world he had known. Now it was all wrong. He could feel it, a shift beneath the surface of what should have been solid, as though the boundaries of existence were loosening. At first, the sensation was subtle. A faint unease, a disconnection between what he saw and what his body told him was real. It began with small details. A monitor blinking back to life for an instant before going dark again, or the way the room felt too large when he walked toward the exit. He paused at the doorway, his hand brushing the cool metal frame, and when he looked back, the lab behind him was different. The walls were darker, the equipment arranged in ways he didn't recognize. For a fleeting moment, he thought he had imagined it, but then the shift came. It wasn't something he could describe. One instant, he was standing in the familiar space of his lab, and in the next, it was as though reality had jolted sideways. He blinked, his vision swimming, and suddenly he was in a place he didn't recognize. The room was vast, filled with machinery he couldn't identify, humming faintly in the background. He turned, his heart racing, and saw symbols etched into the walls, patterns that seemed to move when he tried to focus on them. Before he could even think to move, it happened again. The world snapped back into place, and he was standing in his lab once more. His hands trembled as he looked around, the edges of his vision still unsteady. He knew the term for this phenomenon, though he had never expected to experience it himself. Quantum drift, the unstable tethering of a consciousness to multiple timelines. The Q-gate had linked him to the fractures, and now, he wasn't just observing the collapse. He was part of it. The shifts became more frequent. They came without warning, pulling him from one version of reality to another. In one, the lab was abandoned, dust thick on the equipment, the air heavy with disuse. In another, it was intact but eerily quiet, the monitors displaying strings of data in a language he didn't recognize. In one terrifying moment, he found himself standing in a version of the lab that was engulfed in flames, the heat searing his skin before he was yanked away again. Each shift left him more disoriented than the last. His body felt stretched, as though it existed in too many places at once. Time itself became unreliable. Minutes felt like hours, and then suddenly, they would slip away entirely. He stumbled back to the console, desperate for something, anything, to ground him. But the data streaming across the screen only deepened his dread. The Q-gate had done more than destabilize his reality. The numbers told a grim story of entanglement, a cascading series of events that spread far beyond the lab. The timelines weren't just overlapping, they were collapsing into each other, each fracture rippling outward, pulling countless realities into the chaos. Soren's choice had triggered a timeline collapse event, a phenomenon theorized but never proven. And now it was unstoppable. Kael Vryn was the only person who might understand what was happening. Despite their differences, despite their arguments, Soren knew he needed Kael's mind to make sense of this. But contacting him wasn't simple. Kael had distanced himself after their last confrontation, retreating to his own research facility far from the reach of the Q-gate. Soren had no way of knowing if Kael would even answer. Before he could formulate a plan, the monitors flickered again. This time, they didn't display data. They showed messages, brief, cryptic phrases that scrolled across the screens in jagged text. "You're running out of time? The tether won't hold. Find the anchor." Soren stared, his pulse racing. The messages didn't make sense, but they felt familiar. As if they had come from him, or at least, a version of him. Alternate selves, scattered across the collapsing timelines, trying to warn him. He reached out to the console, his fingers hovering over the keys, but another shift took him before he could act. This time, the world around him was unrecognizable. The lab was gone, replaced by a sprawling cityscape that shimmered like a mirage. Towers stretched into a sky filled with fractured clouds, their edges jagged and uneven. The streets below were silent, empty of life, but the air was thick with an oppressive tension, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Soren took a step forward, and the ground beneath him flickered, threatening to vanish. Then he heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling his name. He turned sharply, searching for the source, but the city shifted around him, the buildings warping like reflections in water. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until he recognized it. His own voice. "You can't stop it. But you can still fix it." The words were spoken with a certainty that chilled him. And then, just as suddenly, he was back in the lab, gasping for air. His knees buckled and he collapsed to the floor, the weight of the experience crushing down on him. The monitors were still flickering with the cryptic messages, but now they were joined by distorted images, faces, places, moments from the fragments he had seen before. He dragged himself to his feet, his mind racing. The warnings were clear. The tether linking him to the timelines was breaking, and when it snapped, he would be lost. But there was something else, something the messages hinted at. An anchor, a way to stabilize the collapse, to pull the timelines back into alignment. He didn't know what it was or how to find it, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he didn't act soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. Soren Hale stumbled forward, his body trembling from the relentless shifts, his mind grasping for clarity in the chaos. The messages, the fractures, the relentless weight of timelines colliding, it was all too much. And then, without warning, he felt it, a sudden stillness, a rare moment of stability. The air around him stilled, the pressure eased, and the flickering stopped. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't in the lab anymore. The place was familiar, yet impossibly distant. Warm sunlight poured through the windows of a room he had thought lost forever. The walls were painted in soft earth tones, and the faint scent of jasmine filled the air. He turned slowly, and there she was, Isolde. She stood by the window, her back to him, her hair catching the light in a way that made his chest tighten. Her presence was unmistakable, alive, vibrant, as if no time had passed since he'd last seen her. Soren's breath caught in his throat. He took a step forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. Isolde. She turned, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. Her face was as he remembered it, her expression soft and knowing. But her eyes, they held something else, a weight he didn't understand. She smiled faintly, and Soren felt a flood of emotion so intense it threatened to break him. Relief, joy, disbelief, it all surged at once, leaving him unsteady. "It's you," he managed, his voice cracking. I thought I'd lost you." She stepped toward him, her movements calm and deliberate, as though she'd been expecting him. Her hand reached out, and when her fingers brushed his, the contact was electric, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Soren," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of sadness he couldn't ignore. "You shouldn't be here." The words hit him like a blow. He shook his head, gripping her hand tighter. No, I had to. I had to find you. I couldn't let you stay lost." Her gaze dropped and she sighed, her fingers slipping from his grasp. She stepped back, her expression shifting from warmth to something more serious. "Soren," she began, her voice steady but laced with a quiet urgency. "Do you know what you've done?" He stared at her, confusion mingling with a creeping sense of dread. "I saved you," he said, his voice rising. "I found the timeline where you're alive. I brought us back together. That's all that matters." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw the full weight of her grief. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You didn't save me. You tore through countless realities to get here. You've seen the fractures, haven't you? The timelines colliding, collapsing? It's because of this, Soren. Because of what you've done." His breath caught, his mind reeling. "No," he stammered. It wasn't supposed to happen. I was careful. I only wanted to fix things." She took another step back, her face etched with sorrow. "Soren, don't you understand? This timeline shouldn't exist. I shouldn't exist. By bringing me back, you've destabilized everything. Every choice you've made to get here. It's unraveled realities you can't even comprehend. You've sacrificed worlds, lives, futures, all for this." Her words pierced him like a blade. He felt the ground beneath him sway, his knees threatening to give way. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I didn't mean to, I just wanted to save you." Her expression softened, but the sadness in her eyes deepened. "I know," she said quietly. "I know why you did it. But you have to see the truth, Soren. Saving me here means condemning everything else." If this timeline survives, the collapse will spread. Nothing will be left. He staggered back, his hands gripping the edges of a nearby table to steady himself. His mind raced, grasping for a way to make sense of her words. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had calculated everything, mapped out the threads, ensured that the Q-gate would anchor to the right moment. How could it have gone so wrong? Then what am I supposed to do? He demanded, his voice rising in desperation. How do I stop it? How do I fix this? Her gaze didn't waver, but her silence was deafening. The answer was there, unspoken, and it was one he couldn't bear to face. You know what you have to do, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You have to let this timeline go. You have to let me go. No. The word tore from him like a cry of anguish. I can't. I won't lose you again. Her eyes filled with tears, but her resolve didn't falter. You never really had me, Soren. Not here. Not like this. I'm just a fragment, a shadow of what you remember. If you hold on to me, you'll lose everything else. He shook his head violently, his heart pounding in his chest. The thought of letting her go again, of returning to a reality where she no longer existed, was unbearable. But her words echoed in his mind, each one a dagger of truth. He had seen the fractures, the chaos. He had felt the weight of what his choices had unleashed. And now, standing before her, he realized that no matter how much he wanted to save her, it was never about what he wanted. It was about what was right. His voice broke as he spoke, his words choked with grief. I don't know if I can do it. She stepped closer, her hand resting gently on his cheek, her touch warm and familiar. You can, she said softly. Because you have to. You always knew it would come to this. Tears blurred his vision as he looked at her, memorizing every detail of her face, every line, every curve, every flicker of emotion in her eyes. I love you, he whispered. And I love you, she replied, her voice steady even as a single tear rolled down her cheek. That's why you have to let me go. As she stepped back, her form began to waver, the edges of her figure blurring like the fragments he had seen before. The timeline was unraveling, the collapse accelerating, and for the first time, Soren understood what it meant to truly let go. He closed his eyes, the image of her face burning into his memory, and when he opened them again, she was gone. The collapse had begun in ways too subtle for most to notice. A flickering light here, a misplaced object there, small inconsistencies that could be dismissed as tricks of the mind. But for Soren Hale, every flicker, every shift, was a reminder of the unraveling chaos he had set in motion. The cracks in reality were spreading, and this time, they weren't confined to the lab. It started with the city. Streets he had walked countless times now curved in impossible ways, their ends vanishing into horizons that didn't belong. Buildings appeared where none had stood before, and others simply dissolved, leaving empty spaces where lives had once been. Soren watched as a woman walking ahead of him on a sidewalk turned a corner and disappeared mid-step, her shadow stretching unnaturally before vanishing altogether. Time itself had become unreliable. A day could pass in moments, or a moment could stretch endlessly, leaving Soren trapped in the uncertainty of what was real. The sounds of the city were distorted, voices overlapping, fragmented conversations from people who might not have existed seconds before. And then there were the people. They flickered, their forms shifting as if they were caught between realities. Some stared at him with hollow, questioning eyes, as if they knew he was the reason for their suffering. Others didn't seem to notice, carrying on with their lives as the ground beneath them twisted into shapes that defied explanation. Soren had no choice but to seek help, and Kael Vryn was the only person who might understand. Contacting him had been a gamble. Kael's voice over the comms had been tense, his words sharp with anger and frustration. But the gravity of the situation couldn't be ignored. Soren had pleaded with him, explaining the fractures, the collapse, the impossible choices that had led to this point. And though Kael's resentment lingered, his fear outweighed his anger. They met in the ruins of a facility that no longer belonged to any one timeline, the walls flickering between steel and glass, their edges jagged and incomplete. Kael wasted no time, his expression grim as he examined the data Soren had brought. He muttered calculations under his breath, his fingers moving across a tablet that shifted between functioning and blank with every passing second. "It's worse than I thought," Kael said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "The Q-gate didn't just disrupt your timeline. It's collapsing all of them. The entanglement is spreading. Every timeline you've touched is destabilizing, pulling others down with it." Soren clenched his fists, the weight of Kael's words pressing down on him. "There has to be a way to stop it," he said, his voice edged with desperation. "There has to be something we can do." Kael looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "There might be," he said slowly. "But you're not going to like it." He turned the tablet toward Soren, displaying a schematic of the Q-gate. The design was overlaid with annotations and warnings, and at the center was a feature Soren had nearly forgotten: a failsafe. "The quantum reset," Kael explained. "It was built into the Q-gate as a last resort. If the entanglement ever reached this level, the reset could theoretically restore balance by severing the connections." Soren stared at the schematic, his heart sinking as he began to understand. "What's the cost?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kael hesitated, his gaze dropping. "The reset works by erasing the initiating tether," he said. "In this case, that's you, Soren. Every timeline you've touched, every version of you connected to this collapse, gone. It's the only way to restore stability." The words hit Soren like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind racing. Erased. Not just from this timeline but from all of them. He would cease to exist, every trace of him wiped away as if he had never been. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice rising. "You're asking me to fix what you broke," Kael interrupted, his tone sharp. "You caused this, Soren. Every choice you made, every step you took to save her, led to this moment. And now, it's not just your timeline at stake. It's all of them. If you don't do this, there won't be anything left." Soren's chest tightened, the weight of the decision crushing him. He thought of Isolde, of her face in the fragments, her words echoing in his mind. "You have to let me go." He had done everything for her, for the chance to save her, to undo the loss that had defined his existence. And now, to fix what he had done, he would have to sacrifice himself entirely. Kael's voice cut through his thoughts. "You don't have much time. The fractures are accelerating. If you don't activate the reset soon, it won't matter. There won't be anything left to save." Soren looked at the schematic again, his vision blurring as tears welled in his eyes. The choice was clear, but it wasn't simple. Every fiber of his being screamed against it, the instinct to survive warring with the knowledge of what was at stake. "Guide me through it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Kael nodded, his expression softening for the first time. "You're doing the right thing," he said. Soren didn't reply. There was no comfort in those words, no solace in what had to be done. He turned toward the Q-gate, its form flickering like the timelines it had shattered. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his existence pressing down on him as he approached the console. The failsafe sequence was long, each input a deliberate reminder of the cost. As he keyed in the final commands, the Q-gate began to hum, its energy building into a crescendo that resonated through the collapsing reality. Soren closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he placed them on the activation panel. He thought of Isolde one last time, her face, her voice, the love they had shared. And then, with a deep breath, he pressed the button. The Q-gate loomed ahead, its structure flickering like a mirage caught between realities. The hum of its unstable energy reverberated through the fractured corridors as Soren Hale and Kael Vryn ran, their footsteps echoing against the cold metal floors. Around them, the world was collapsing. Walls dissolved into mist, reappeared as jagged fragments, and then shifted into configurations that defied logic. The air itself seemed heavy, warped by the weight of infinite timelines converging and breaking apart. Soren stumbled, his breath ragged as his body struggled to keep up. Each step felt like a battle against the very fabric of existence, which no longer adhered to any rules he could understand. Memories surged unbidden, flashes of a life that felt distant yet painfully immediate. He saw Isolde's laughter in the warm glow of their apartment, the way she used to tease him about his meticulous habits. He saw her frown as she studied his notes, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the way her eyes had lit up the day they first discussed the Q-gate, her excitement infectious as they dreamed of possibilities that now felt like cruel illusions. But then came the darker memories, the ones he couldn't escape. The sterile light of the hospital room after the accident. The emptiness in her gaze as he clutched her hand, willing her to stay. The hollow ache that followed, driving him to make the choices that had led to this moment. Kael's voice snapped him back to the present. "We're running out of time," he shouted, his tone sharp but strained. He was gripping a handheld device, its screen pulsing with chaotic readings, the entanglements reaching critical levels. "If we don't activate the reset soon—" "I know." Soren cut him off, his voice hoarse. He didn't need the reminder. The fractures around them were proof enough. A jagged line tore through the floor ahead of them, glowing faintly as it spread. They leapt over it just as the section of the corridor behind them disintegrated, vanishing into a void that pulsed with shifting light. Soren's chest tightened, his heart pounding not just from exertion but from the weight of what lay ahead. He knew what activating the reset meant. He had accepted it, or so he thought. But with every step closer to the Q-gate, the enormity of the sacrifice bore down on him like a tidal wave. Another flash of memory struck him, Isolde standing at his side, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as they gazed at the Q-gate for the first time. "This is it," she had said, her voice filled with wonder. "This is the beginning of everything, and now it would be the end." They reached the final chamber, the heart of the Q-gate, and Soren felt his resolve harden despite the turmoil inside him. The machine towered before them, its core pulsating with unstable energy. The control panel flickered, the symbols on its surface shifting between intelligible and alien. Kael worked quickly, inputting commands to stabilize the failsafe system. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his face was pale, his expression grim. "You're sure about this?" he asked without looking up. Soren didn't answer immediately. He stepped toward the console, his gaze fixed on the glowing reset mechanism. His mind raced with the memories of every choice, every mistake, every moment that had led him here. He took a deep breath. "There's no other way," he said finally. Just as he reached for the activation sequence, a flash of light erupted from the Q-gate's core. Soren staggered back, shielding his eyes as the light coalesced into a figure that made his blood run cold. It was him. Not a reflection, not a fragment, but a version of himself, older and worn, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. The other Soren stepped forward, his expression grave. "Don't do it," he said, his voice calm but firm. Soren froze, his hand hovering above the panel. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "The reset is the only way to fix this." The older version shook his head slowly. "The reset will stop the collapse," he said, "but it won't save her. Isolde doesn't exist in the original timeline anymore. You already know that." Soren's breath caught, his chest tightening as the words sank in. "You're lying," he said, his voice shaking. "If I fix the timelines, if I restore balance, she'll be there. She has to be." The other Soren's expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I thought the same thing," he said. "In every version of us, we believe the same thing. But it's not true. Isolde's gone, Soren. She was gone the moment you made the first choice to save her." Soren's hand trembled as he lowered it, his mind racing. "Then what's the point?" he asked, his voice breaking. "What's the point of all of this if I can't bring her back?" The older Soren stepped closer, his gaze steady. "The point is to save everything else," he said. Every life, every moment, every possibility that still exists. If you don't press that button, none of it will survive. Soren's throat tightened, his vision blurring with unshed tears. He looked at the console, at the Q gate, at the unstable reality around him. And then he thought of Isolde, her smile, her laughter, the way she had always believed in him. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "Will it hurt?" he asked quietly. The older Soren nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "But it will be quick." Soren stepped forward, his hand resting on the activation panel. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with every memory of Isolde, every moment they had shared. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he pressed the button. The Q gate roared to life, its energy surging in a blinding cascade of light and sound. Soren felt himself pulled into the core, his body dissolving into the fractures, his existence unraveling with the timelines he had touched. For one brief, excruciating moment, he felt everything, the weight of every life, every choice, every reality collapsing and reforming. And then there was silence. The silence that followed was deafening. The Q gate's light dimmed to nothing, its once mighty hum gone, leaving the chamber cloaked in a stillness that felt alien. Kael Vryn stood motionless, his hands trembling, his breaths shallow and uneven. Around him, the world had steadied, its jagged edges smoothing, the fractures mending like wounds closing after a long battle. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the fabric of reality was quiet. The chaos that had consumed everything, the distortions, the flickering, the collapsing cities, was no more. Kael had expected relief, but all he felt was a hollow ache, a void left by the absence of the man who had given everything to make this moment possible. Soren Hale was gone. Kael stumbled back from the console, his legs weak, his thoughts a haze of disbelief and exhaustion. He stared at the Q gate, now lifeless, its intricate design nothing more than cold machinery. There was no sign of Soren, no trace of his presence. It was as if he had never existed. The air around Kael felt heavier now, not with distortion but with the weight of what had been lost. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands, his mind replaying the final moments over and over. He had seen Soren's face as he pressed the button, calm, resolute, and, above all, filled with a quiet acceptance. It was an expression Kael knew he would never forget. Time passed, though Kael couldn't say how much. Minutes? Hours? It hardly mattered. Eventually, he forced himself to his feet, his body protesting every movement. The world outside the Q gate chamber had returned to its familiar state. The corridors were solid again, their walls unmarred by fractures. The lights burned steadily, their glow constant and unbroken. Yet everything felt wrong, as if the world itself was mourning the man who had saved it. Kael moved through the facility, his steps heavy, his mind caught in a fog. He reached Soren's workspace, a small, cluttered corner of the lab filled with notes, schematics, and fragments of theories that only Soren could have deciphered. Kael hesitated, his gaze falling on the desk, and then he saw it, a single sheet of paper, folded neatly and placed in the center of the workspace. His hands shook as he picked it up, unfolding it with care. The handwriting was unmistakably Soren's, the words precise and deliberate. The note was short, but its meaning was profound. The greatest gift is the choice to let go. Kael stared at the note, his chest tightening. He read the words again and again, his mind struggling to grasp their weight. Soren had known. He had known what this choice would mean, not just for himself but for the countless lives tethered to the timelines he had fractured. And yet, he had done it anyway. Kael sat down at the desk, the note still in his hand. Around him, the world felt painfully still, as if it too was waiting for something. He thought of the man who had once been his closest ally, his greatest rival, and, in the end, the only one willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. The Q gate was silent now, its power extinguished. The fractures had been healed, the timelines restored. But Soren's absence was a wound that would never fully close. Kael knew that no one would remember Soren Hale, not in this timeline, not in any timeline. His name, his work, his very existence had been erased. All that remained was this note, a fragment of a man who had given everything to save a world that would never know him. Kael folded the note carefully, placing it back on the desk. He sat in the quiet of the lab, his thoughts heavy, his heart weighed down by the enormity of what had been lost. The world outside moved on, unaware of the sacrifice that had made its existence possible. Cities rebuilt themselves, people resumed their lives, the fractures of forgotten memory. Yet Kael would remember. He would carry the weight of Soren's choice, the knowledge of the man who had saved everything by choosing to let go. And in the silence of the lab, with only the faint hum of machinery in the background, Kael whispered the words he knew Soren would never hear. "Thank you." The Q gate stood dormant, its presence a reminder of what had been, and what could have been. And as the world turned, untouched by the collapse it had narrowly escaped, Kael felt the quiet echo of Soren's final act. One quantum choice was all it took, to destroy and to save everything. If you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.